Hi and welcome back. In this video we're going to cover both the 1850s and the 1860s slave schedules. And again, these records will be specifically for people living in the United States of America or people who have ancestors who did live in the USA. When dealing with any kind of a census record, and these could be slave schedules, official census returns, agricultural returns, tax lists, tax censuses, there's basically four things you should always keep in mind. And the first one, these records are only as good as the enumerator, and that's the person who's collected the information. They're only as good as the information that that person's provided. So whether they've misheard things, left things out, not understood things, all of that comes into play with these kind of records. The second point to keep in mind is the information is only accurate as the individual who gave it. So again, one of your ancestors, might be someone from the extended family if you're starting to research different branches of your family, is that the information that's provided also comes into play. The third thing to keep in mind is many people weren't actually counted in census returns. I know in our modern day and age it seems almost impossible to think that people could have been left out, but you'd actually be surprised at the staggering number of people, again, especially in rural communities, who weren't entered into the census at all. And the fourth thing to keep in mind is human error, especially around transcription. In transcription, it's just the process of someone's got a really old record, an original record in front of them, and they have to take all that information and they actually have to put it in a digital format. And for people like me, and hopefully people like you, we're actually going to get most of our family information through through online research, looking at records that have been digitized and that information provided online. And again, for any of us who've actually come across records that were written in the 18th century, 19th century, 16th century, or before, handwriting can be a bit of a challenge. They have very florid, very kind of creative handwriting. And while it may look absolutely beautiful, trying to make sense of what it is that they've written, trying to decipher what it is that they've written, can be a bit of a challenge. So again, it's worth bearing in mind those four aspects. Now that you know some of the challenges that you might face, going through digitized records, or you happen to stumble across an original record, there is still some really good news. In spite of all the possible inconsistencies that there might be in the information that was either given or taken, and again, that could be illegible handwriting, it could be the ages of the individuals involved, which you saw in the previous video. Sometimes people didn't know their year of birth, they had to guess their age, they had to guess their year of birth. So again, there's going to be errors with that as well. And despite even errors in places of birth, or places of birth that don't particularly add up with the information that you have, census records are still an invaluable way, an invaluable tool to be able to research both your genealogy and your family history. And they really are probably the easiest, most accessible, and best defense that you have to start entangling the history of where your family came from and finding out more about them. One thing to keep in mind is, yes, the slave schedules may or may not cause you some challenges. If they do cause you some challenges, it doesn't necessarily mean that your family research activity has to end. I, for one, love a good challenge. So again, it's the sense of fulfillment that I actually get when I actually crack that little bit of a mystery using these schedules. It's a brilliant experience, and I'm usually pretty much on a high afterwards, by just persevering and just getting my head down and doing it. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples, things to think about, how you can actually tie in what you find with your 1870 census returns, particularly with these schedules. And again, hopefully that's going to give you the confidence to be able to go on and crack these with a sense of confidence. Say, for instance, you found your ancestor Joe Bloggs in the 1870 census return. In the 1870s return, he's cited as being a 43-year-old black male who's a farmer. Now, on the surface of things, that doesn't really seem like it's a lot of information, but actually it is. You have his age, which is 43, and that, again, it's going to be an approximate age more than likely, so you can work out his approximate year of birth. If he's 43 in 1870, then his year of birth is either going to be 1837, roughly, or 1836. Again, it'll depend on what month he was born in, all those kind of things. So you have an approximate framework of information to work with already. You have a name, you have an occupation, you have a place of residence, and you also have some sort of a physical description. He's listed as black. He's not listed as mulatto, for instance. Anything that you can do to make that particular ancestor a real, true individual, the easier it's going to be in the long run for you to find out more information about them and to be able to trace his history back. And again, if you can find out things like a middle name, anything you can do to make your ancestor as distinctive as possible, to make them stand out more easily through the records that you're researching, the better off that you can be. Especially, a name like Joe Bloggs, it could be Joe Smith. How many black males born in 1836 or 1837 in a particular county, say in the state of Virginia, are going to be called John Smith or Joe Smith? There are going to be loads of them. So anything that you can do to narrow that kind of that pool of potential candidates who might be your ancestor down, the better off that it's going to be for you. For instance, if you're going through a whole list of Joe Bloggs, born roughly in 1837 or 1836, say for instance you come up with 12 of them. Well, if 5 of them are black and all the other ones are mulattoes or white, well, you can almost immediately dismiss all the mulattoes and all the whites. You've immediately got a much, much smaller pool of candidates to start going through and start figuring out, well, which one is the right ancestor for me. So moving on to the next stage of this particular example, so we have a black male, Joe Bloggs, born in the town of Wythe in Virginia, either 1836 or 1837. We know he's roughly 43 in the year of 1870. So in the year 1860, that would mean he would be 33 years old. Go back another 10 years to 1850, your ancestor would be 23. So again, for the 1860s, you would be looking for a 33-year-old black male. In the 1850s slave schedule, you'd be looking for a 23-year-old black male. The primary reason why the 1850s and 1860s slave schedules can be a bit off-putting to people researching their family history is they're in a different format than the traditional census return. Traditional census return lists every family member by their name. That doesn't happen with slave schedules. If it does, it's very, very unusual. Primarily, it's the way that they're arranged is by slave owner. Again, without getting into the morality or the ethics of slavery, it was what it was. And fortunately, we have to accept that. Slaves were property. And when you see one of these schedules, you'll get the very distinct, you'll see it for yourself. Human beings were treated as property. End of story. So in a slave schedule, you'll have a slave owner, and you'll have all his or her slaves listed, not by name. It's really unusual to find a slave schedule that actually lists the slaves by name. It's always done by gender and by age. So you'll see a whole list of people, whether they're male or female, it'll give their age, with a couple of other bits and pieces of information. Actually, literally in a minute or two, I'm going to show you both blank slave schedules and completed slave schedules, so this will make more sense to you. Again, that's why it's really important to, one, get a sense of how your ancestor appears in slave schedules after the end of the Civil War. Whether they're black, whether they're mulatto, roughly whether your birth was, their age, whether they were married or not, their children, their children's ages. Because I don't know how unusual my own family's experience was, but most of my ancestors were kept together as family groups, and those family groups were kept together from generation after generation after generation. Largely because they were actually related and openly acknowledged by their white slave owners as family members. So they did everything they could to actually keep them together, not split them up. Some other things to bear in mind is slave schedules will only make sense if you know the name of the person who owned your ancestors, or the names of the people who owned your ancestors. Again, slave schedules are going to be a lot more easier to tackle if the slave owner themselves was a small slave owner or a fairly moderate one. Once you start seeing slave schedules with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of slaves, again, because people's years of birth can radically differ, and they're not sure of it themselves, it can be really, really, really tricky to actually definitively figure out which one is your ancestor. So for instance, for me, most of the people who owned my family members were small slave owners or moderate in size, and by moderate I would probably say 30 slaves or less. And as if, for instance, if you're researching it, say, your great-great-great-grandmother, who, I don't know, might have been 23 years old and listed as a mulatto in 1870, well, going back 10 years to the 1860 slave schedule, there could be as many, depending on the size of the slave owner themselves, there could be as many as 5, 10, 15 mulatto females of the same age. So you can see where it gets easier if it's a smaller slave owner. There's only one female who's mulatto and approximately the right age. The chances are really, really good that is the person that you're looking for. So these are things to again, bear in mind. One last clue before we take a quick look at these slave schedules is the county where your ancestors lived and were born. Again, this works really, really well for more rural areas. I've noticed a difference already that when I'm trying to trace ancestors in cities like Richmond, Newport News, or wherever, Charleston, for instance, um, this particular tip doesn't quite start to fall down, but again, it's worth bearing in mind. Most of my ancestors who lived in a really rural area lived there for a long, long time. So taking the Sheffys for Whitfield, Sheffys have been in Whitfield, at least on the African American side of the family, since right before the Revolutionary War. So they were residents in the same place, which makes it a lot easier to, one, find my immediate ancestors, two, find out who their slave owners were, and three, kind of just track the growth and the progression of the family. And I'll be the first one to admit that finding slave owners not necessarily the easiest thing to do. Again, really, really good port of call is research. A lot of really old slave owners' wills are available in digital format online. And again, that's how I've been able to find out who owned quite a lot of my immediate ancestors, as well as ancestors within the different branches of the family. And through these wills, I could see how the family groups were kept together and were actually willed from one person to the next generation to the next generation. And funnily enough, again, always either staying within Wythe County in Virginia with the Sheffy family, or again, keeping with the Sheffy family in Smythe and Marion County in Virginia. And again, being able to finally locate the people who owned them, because they were kept within the same family, they were kept together as a family group, made the whole process of tackling the 1850s and 1860s census so much more easier for me. Other documents that might help you locate who actually owned your ancestors, if indeed they had been slaves, would be things like bills of sale. Again, I wouldn't say they're exactly commonplace online, but I'm beginning to see them more and more and more often. These kind of records of sales that have been digitized. Auctions. Again, if you can find those, if those records exist, they're also another really, really good resource. I would say the one thing that really has helped me though are the wills that were done by the slave owners, citing specifically who was going to inherit different African American family groups. So now we're going to move on to the 1850s and 1860s slave schedules. And at this point, it's probably a good idea just to kind of remind everyone that before the Civil War, not all African Americans were slaves. Let's face it, many millions were. But there was also a fairly sizable population of free blacks living in the United States, both the North End and the South. So again, it's kind of worth bearing that in mind. Not all of your ancestors would have been slaves. Some of them would have been free. Some of my ancestors were free well before the American Revolution, so they wouldn't actually show up on these kind of censuses, although the larger part of the African American side of my family were slaves and can be found in these various schedules. Chances are that if you are African American, you are going to have an ancestor amongst those many, many millions who were enslaved. You're going to come up against the slave schedules. And these aren't necessarily the easiest kind of census records to actually interpret or kind of get definitive, viable information for you to be able to trace your ancestry. But I would advise you to stick with it. Here we have a classic example of the 1850s slave schedule. And again, just to bear in mind, this one's for the United States. Um, you can see where it's prompted for information about the location where the census was taken, the year that it was actually taken, the name of the marshal who is responsible for collecting all this information. When I was mentioning an enumerator earlier on in the video, that's pretty much the marshal that's here. And here we can see the really basic information that they were after. So name of slave owner would go in the left-hand column, the number of slaves that that particular person had. This is where they would break it down by age, which you'll see in column number 3. These are all the descriptive things. Age, gender, color. Color, by and large, will only ever be black or mulatto, usually highlighted by a B for black or M for mulatto. Then some really interesting things, if you see on column number 6, whether or not that individual was a fugitive from the state. In other words, were they a runaway? Because again, slaves were property. We have the Underground Railroad going into Canada, plus people escaping slavery and remaining in the United States. So again, this is another way that the government could keep track of the percentage of slaves who did run away. Also, if you look at column number 7, the number manumitted, basically it means whether or not they were free. Again, they wanted to keep, especially in Virginia and other southern states, they were quite aware of the growing kind of free population of black people, and they wanted to keep an eye on that. And other, the other things that you would expect to find on either a schedule or a proper census return, whether they were deaf and dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic. Really not sure what the government does with that information, but they did collect it. So here, thanks to Ancestry.com, blank 1850s slave schedule. Of a completed 1850s slave schedule. This one is for the 8th District for Wythe County in the state of Virginia, done on the 3rd of August, 1850. And actually, this is actually a really good example because it's a really good example of some of the issues and problems that I was mentioning much earlier in the video. So for me, this is really, really difficult writing to read and decipher. So you can imagine if I'm actually being paid or even volunteering to try to transcribe this, to make this available for anyone who wants to research their family. It's a bit of a challenge. But luckily enough, I can read this one. Line number 9, Daniel Sheffey, who again is a distant relation on the white side of the family. And scrolling back up to the top, exactly what we went over in the blank version of this form. We've got the name of the slave owners. I've already pointed out Daniel, number of slaves, age, sex, color, other bits and pieces of information about them. So in 1850, we can see that Daniel Sheffey had 4 slaves. He had a 25-year-old female. This is on line 9. So one 25-year-old female who was black. He had one 18-year-old male who was black. He had one female who was 1 year old who was mulatto. He also had one female who was also mulatto who was age 70. And luckily, because he is such a small slave owner, and he was always a small slave owner, it was really easy to go through my family tree and figure out who each one of these people were. So again, classic example of the reason why it's much easier to trace your ancestry back if some of your ancestors were actually owned by a slave owner who didn't have many slaves, especially when you're dealing with such radically different ages, 25, 18, 1, 70. Really, really easy to figure out. Much easier to figure out than this chap on line 16, whose name is Robert something. I can't really quite read it, but when you start going down his list of slaves, he owns quite a few. Not only just quite a few, but also quite a few who are the same age and same description. Again, if you look at lines 24 and 25, he has two 16-year-old females who are both black. That's for anyone who's trying to research their family, and they're trying to figure out which of these two women are actually their ancestors, it's really, really difficult. Again, that's where finding this gentleman's will, if one's available, will hopefully make that process much, much easier. Here we have the 1860 slave schedules. You can see it's not radically different from the 1851 at all. It's asking the same it's providing the same sort of information, where the schedule information came from, the county, the state, the date, who the assistant marshal was, asking exactly the same information again, who the slave owners were, the number of slaves that they had, the description of the slaves, and exactly, whether or not they were fugitives, runaways, how many slaves had been freed, and other characteristics that have been collected on these kind of schedules and census returns. So this, again, classic example of the standard 1860s slave schedule. The completed 1860 slave schedule return. So again, this covers the 1st District and the County of Augusta in the state of Virginia, 27th of July, 1860. There's our marshal with his name there. And the ancestor that I want to take a look at for this one is this chap here in line 11, whose name is Hugh White Sheffey, again from the white side of the family. And although, again, something that's slightly confusing with this one, in the right-hand column next to his name, you would expect to see the number of slaves of that age. Or instead, they basically said they've numbered his slaves, so it's basically telling us he has 8 slaves. At first I got really confused by this one because I thought, if you go down to line 12, that they were saying that he had 2 men who were both 29 and black, but that's not what this is saying at all. Basically they're saying that Hugh had 8 slaves. He had 1 male who was black, who was 30, another 29-year-old male who was black, a 40-year-old female who was black. Well, actually all of his slaves are black. There are no mulattoes there at all. A 34-year-old male, 28-year-old female, 25-year-old female, 3-year-old male, and a 2-year-old female. This one's proven a bit tricky, unfortunately, because he has quite a number of even though he has a small number of slaves, the slaves he does have are fairly close to each other in age in some instances. So again, bearing in mind that dates of birth are inaccurate, which means the ancestor's age that you're looking at is inaccurate, it's going to be really difficult to tell the difference between the 30-year-old male and the 29-year-old male as to who might be your actual ancestor. And I haven't even to be honest, I haven't even worked that one out yet. I have a name for the 40-year-old female. She was easy to do. She's the only female of that age in that who was a slave on his land. Again, we skip down to lines 15 and 16. We have a 28-year-old and a 25-year-old female. Really, really difficult to tell who's who. And even now, I haven't been able to assign a specific name to either one of these because there are quite a few candidates that it could be. But again, the 3-year-old male and the 2-year-old female ended up being really, really straightforward to figure out who they were. So as you can see, these are very different in the portrayal of their information than the traditional census returns. And these two schedules really do put off a lot of people. They just get to them and they see them and they just immediately say, well, if it doesn't have a name, I'm never going to be able to figure out which one of these people are actually my ancestor, to be able to carry that story back a bit further. But I would invite you to persevere, because again, unlocking this information, for me, it was just the sense of achievement in being able to do that was, I wouldn't say overwhelming, but it's just such a brilliant experience to be able to kind of crack this particular mystery and get the answers that I was seeking. Another set of records that may help you with this, and I'm going to do a video just on this one particular topic, are the freedmen bank records. Again, at the end of the Civil War, you had the Freedmen Bank that was set up so that newly freed slaves, plus also free African Americans, could set up bank accounts. And these records are invaluable because the data that was collected, for a family research person's point of view, was incredible. A lot of times it'll give you the name, the person opening up that Freedman account would give the names of their parents, whether their parents were alive or dead, their owners, the names of their brothers and sisters, and particularly with their sisters. If their sisters had married, would give their sister's married name as well as her maiden name. And again, there's going to be another video about the importance of the females in family history research. A lot of times they get overlooked, and I'm guilty of this as well when I first started. They have, apart from the blindingly obvious, the ladies in your family have a crucial role to play. But again, that's going to be a topic of a whole other video. Another set of records that might help you unlock the secrets of both the 1850s and 1860s slave schedules, and these were called cohabitation registers. Not all slave-owning states had them. They were usually done right at the end of the Civil War, so roughly about 1866. Again, majority of my paternal slave ancestors lived in Virginia, and Virginia was very thorough, or at least many of its counties were very thorough in doing what were called cohabitation registers. And this is basically freed slaves who were living together as man and wife, or by all accounts, many of them were actually properly married. And they had, and again, cohabitation registers, invaluable information. They provide the names of the last slave owners of the couple that were cohabitating. It also listed the names and ages of their children as well. So again, this is going to be yet another video that I'll be doing in the future, but a really, really good, invaluable source of African American family research, and can also provide some really, really good clues in terms of, well, especially because they give you the name of the slave owners, good, solid, crucial information and data that you need to start unlocking the secrets that are hidden within these slave schedules. So this brings us to the end of the video about slave schedules, and I hope you found the information useful. I hope it's given you confidence to be able to tackle these 1850s and 1860s slave schedules. They don't necessarily need to be as intimidating or as daunting or as awful as you might think that they might be. Like anything else, a lot of it will come down to research, diligence, and just bloody-mindedness and perseverance. So again, I hope you found this useful. I hope this has encouraged you to do your own research. And until the next time, have a good one. See you later. Bye.